She stared at the bone marrow, consent form with trembling hands, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the tears streaming down her pale face, as she finally understood why she existed. "They didn't want a daughter, Dr. Harris," she whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of the ultimate betrayal. "They just needed spare parts." But to understand how this perfect family shattered in my trauma bay, we have to go back to when the freezing rain began to fall. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything? The sliding glass doors of Boston Memorial's emergency room parted with a mechanical hiss, letting in a bitter November draft and a terrified 16-year-old girl. Her name was Maya, and she was clutching her chest, gasping for air as if the freezing rain outside had suddenly filled her lungs. She had been scheduled for a bone marrow harvest the following morning to save her older brother, Leo, who was actively dying of aggressive leukemia, upstairs. Instead, she had collapsed in the hospital lobby, crippled by a sudden, violent panic attack that sent her stumbling into my chaotic domain. I guided her to bed the rhythmic squeak of my rubber solace, on the linoleum attempting to set a calm tempo against her erratic breathing. Her parents, Richard and Sarah, hovered behind us like desperate hawks, their eyes wide with a frantic intensity that immediately put me on edge. They weren't just worried about their daughter. They looked completely terrified that their meticulously planned medical procedure was unraveling at the last possible second. I strapped a blood pressure cuff to her fragile arm, feeling the furious thumping of her pulse beneath her pale, clammy skin. "She needs to be okay for tomorrow. Doctor, please," her mother pleaded, her voice trembling with an urgency that felt uncomfortably transactional. I did not respond immediately, focusing instead on the way Maya's knuckles turned white as she gripped the thin, scratchy hospital blanket, seeking any solid anchor. The monitor beeped in a frantic staccato, displaying a heart rate of 140. A visual manifestation of a nervous system past its breaking point. I ordered a mild sedative and basic labs, hoping to rule out any underlying cardiac anomaly before the massive surgery. While the nurses established in line, I stood by the foot of the bed, watching the complex, silent dynamics of a family pushed to the brink. Richard paced the narrow bay, incessantly checking his watch and glancing upward toward the ceiling, as if trying to see straight through the concrete to his dying son. He barely looked at Maya, treating her temporary crisis more like a logistical nightmare than a moment requiring a father's tender, unconditional comfort. I have worked in this department for decades, and you quickly learn to recognize the subtle difference between parental love and desperate necessity. Maya's breathing slowly began to regulate as the medication flowed through her veins, the sharp angles of her shoulders dropping back against the stiff mattress. She turned her dark, exhausted eyes toward me, carrying a heaviness that I rarely see in teenagers who haven't yet been battered by the world's cruelties. I just felt like the walls were closing in, like I couldn't escape my own skin, she whispered, the words carrying a profound, unsettling subtext. I offered her a reassuring nod, pulling up my stool to sit beside her, intending to offer a moment of quiet solidarity amidst the clinical chaos. Pre-surgical anxiety is normal, Maya, especially when the stakes are this incredibly high for your brother, I told her, my voice low and steady. But as I reviewed her digital chart on my tablet, cross-referencing her recent lab work, a highly specific genetic notation caught my eye. It was an addendum buried deep in her immunological profile, indicating a method of conception that framed the parents' behavior in a chilling new light. The quiet hum of the faded as the reality of her existence crystallized on the glowing screen resting in my hands. The notation in her chart was unmistakable PGD, or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, paired with a virtually impossible HLA match for her older brother. I stared at the harsh blue light of the screen, the clinical abbreviation hitting my chest with the force of a physical blow as the truth settled in. Maya wasn't just a lucky, random genetic match, who happened to be born at the right time to save her sibling from a devastating illness. She had been scientifically engineered. Selected from a petri dish of embryos specifically because she possessed the exact cellular compatibility required to be a living donor. Before I could process the ethical weight of this discovery, the curtain to Bedford violently whipped open, shattering the fragile quiet of the bay. Maya was holding her mother's designer leather purse, having searched it for her lip balm, but her trembling fingers were clutching a folded stack of old medical documents. "What is this clinic in Chicago?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch, cutting through the ambient noise of the emergency room like a jagged piece of glass. Richard froze in his tracks, his face draining of all color, while Sarah let out a stifled, horrifying gasp that immediately confirmed the girl's worst suspicions. Maya swung her legs over the edge of the gurney, the cardiac monitor resuming its frantic alarm as her heart rate skyrocketed back into the danger zone. "It says IVF. It says save your sibling protocol on this billing statement from 16 years ago," she read aloud, the paper shaking violently in her pale hands. The air in the trauma bay suddenly grew dense, thick with a suffocating tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. She looked at her parents, her desperate eyes pleading for a denial, searching for a single shred of reassurance that the words were a terrible mistake. "Maya, sweetheart, please lie down. Your heart can't take this stress," Sarah begged, stepping forward with her hands raised as if approaching a frightened, cornered animal. But the teenager recoiled violently, slapping her mother's hands away with a fierce, heartbreaking sob that echoed off the sterile, unforgiving tiles of the hospital walls. The betrayal fractured her entire reality in real time. The foundational truth of her identity crumbling beneath the clinical fluorescent lights of my emergency department. I stepped between them, raising my hands to establish a physical boundary, knowing that a physiological collapse was imminent if we didn't de-escalate immediately. "Did you have me just to save Leo?" Maya screamed, the raw agony in her voice silencing the neighboring bays and bringing the nurse's station to a standstill. Richard looked down at the scuffed linoleum floor, unable to meet his daughter's devastated gaze, his profound silence providing the most damning answer she could ever receive. The monitor screamed its warning as Maya's breathing became rapid and shallow, her body going rigid before she suddenly went limp, collapsing backward onto the mattress. The emotional shock had triggered a vasovagal syncope, shutting down her system entirely as a protective mechanism against a truth too agonizing to consciously endure. I caught her shoulders before her head could strike the metal railing, easing her back down as the medical team rushed in to assist with the collapse. "Out, both of you, get out of my trauma bay right now," I barked at the parents, my voice carrying the unquestionable authority of a seasoned attending physician. They retreated into the bustling hallway, leaving behind a shattered teenage girl who was slowly waking up to a nightmare she could never escape. I stood over her, feeling the heavy, cold weight of my stethoscope against my neck, preparing for the inevitable collision between medical duty and profound human tragedy. When Maya finally regained full consciousness, the trauma bay felt as isolated and quiet as a tomb, sealed off from the relentless chaos of the surrounding hospital. She refused to look at me, keeping her tear-streaked face turned toward the blank wall, her fragile shoulders rising and falling with silent, rhythmic sobs. Tomorrow morning, a surgical team was waiting to drill into her pelvic bone, extracting the vital marrow that would give her brother a chance at life. But the girl lying in front of me was entirely broken, paralyzed by the terrifying realization that her physical body was never truly her own. "I love Leo," she whispered to the wall, her voice hoarse and fragile, sounding like a small child lost in a vast, unforgiving wilderness. But every time they kissed me goodnight, every time they celebrated my birthday, were they just maintaining their investment, keeping the spare parts healthy? The question hung in the cold, antiseptic air, an impossible philosophical burden placed on the shoulders of a teenager who just wanted to be loved for existing. I sat on my stool, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, possessing decades of medical knowledge but entirely devoid of the words required to heal this wound. Under hospital policy and the law, Maya was technically a minor, meaning her parents held the ultimate legal authority over her medical care and scheduled procedures. However, the ethical guidelines surrounding bone marrow donation required a secondary layer of protection, the explicit, uncoerced assent of the minor patient before any anesthesia could be administered. If she refused to walk into that operating room tomorrow, if she revoked her verbal agreement, I would be legally and morally obligated to intervene and halt the transplant. The power over life and death had suddenly shifted into her trembling hands, transforming a medical procedure into a devastating test of autonomy and familial loyalty. The hospital's ethics committee would take days to convene, a luxury of time that Leo's rapidly failing immune system absolutely did not have in this critical hour. Richard entered the bay, his posture defeated, his eyes red-rimmed from crying in the hallway, looking completely shattered by the collateral damage of his desperate choices. "We lost 3 babies before Leo," he pleaded from the foot of the bed, his voice cracking as he confessed the painful history that led to this moment. "When he got sick, we couldn't lose him too. We didn't just want a donor, Maya. We wanted you. We just needed to make sure you could save him." Maya finally turned her head, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce anger that momentarily overpowered the crushing despair threatening to consume her spirit. "You didn't want me, Dad. You wanted a perfectly matched biological insurance policy wrapped in a pink blanket," she countered, the brutal honesty slicing through his defense. I watched the father physically recoil, absorbing the punishing truth of his daughter's accusation, realizing that in his desperate attempt to save one child, he had destroyed the other. The monitor continued its steady, indifferent beeping, offering a stark contrast to the incredibly messy, complex human tragedy unfolding within the narrow confines of my walkspace. I asked Richard to leave once more, pulling the heavy curtain firmly shut to give Maya the psychological space she desperately needed to process the impossible choice. "Dr. Harris," she looked up at me, the sheer vulnerability in her gaze cutting straight through the hardened emotional armor I had built over 25 years. "If I say no tomorrow, if I refuse to let them put me under, he dies, and it will be entirely my fault, won't it?" I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the agonizing weight of her dilemma, knowing that whatever path she chose, she would carry the scars forever. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest as I searched for an honest answer that wouldn't completely destroy her. "If you say no, Maya, the disease kills your brother. Not you," I said softly, emphasizing the absolute truth that guilt is a liar we too often believe. "Your body is yours, your marrow is yours, and no one, not even the people who gave you life, has the right to force you to surrender it." She absorbed my words, her trembling fingers nervously tracing the plastic tubing of the 4th line, her mind violently oscillating between profound resentment and unconditional sibling love. Suddenly, the harsh overhead intercom cracked open, the emergency operator's voice echoing through the corridors, announcing a code blue on the 7th floor pediatric oncology ward. Maya's breath caught in her throat, her entire body stiffening as the unmistakable room number blared through the speakers, confirming that Leo was actively crashing upstairs. The fragile stability he had maintained for weeks was suddenly collapsing, his weakened body giving out just hours before the procedure that was supposed to save him. The abstract ethical debate had instantly evaporated, replaced by the terrifying, immediate reality of death standing on the doorstep, demanding a final answer right now. I grabbed the bedside phone. dialing the rapid response team on the 7th floor to get real-time clinical updates, while Maya watched me in absolute terror. They had managed to restart his heart, but his vitals were wildly unstable. He wouldn't survive another 48 hours without the immediate infusion of healthy, matched stem cells. I hung up the receiver, turning slowly back to the terrified teenager, my chest aching as I delivered the grim prognosis without sugarcoating the brutal medical reality. He stabilized, but his time is up, Maya. The transplant team is moving the surgery to tonight, right now. As soon as we can clear you, the finality of the moment slammed into her. Her chest heaving as she stared at the blank consent form resting on the metal tray table beside her bed. The parents burst through the curtain, completely ignoring my previous orders, their faces masked in pure panic as they threw themselves at the mercy of their devastated daughter. "Please, Maya, I am begging you, please save your brother," Sarah sobbed, falling to her knees on the cold linoleum, stripping away all parental authority in primal desperation. It was the ugliest, most agonizing manifestation of love I had ever witnessed. A mother sacrificing the psychological well-being of one child to preserve the beating heart of another. I stepped forward, my voice booming with a fierce, protective authority that shocked everyone in the room, demanding that the parents back away from the gurney immediately. "Do not pressure her. Do not touch her. This is her medical decision and hers alone," I commanded, placing my body physically between the kneeling mother and the patient. The room went dead silent, the only sound the frantic beeping of Maya's heart monitor and the heavy, ragged breathing of a family standing on the precipice of ruin. I handed Maya a blue ink pen, looking her directly in the eyes, offering her the ultimate respect of pure, unadulterated autonomy in her darkest moment. She looked at the pen, then at her sobbing parents, and finally at me, her young face hardening into an expression of profound, tragic maturity that she never needed. "I'm not doing this for you," she whispered, her voice slicing through the room with glacial precision, aiming the words directly at her shattered mother and father. "I am doing this because he is my brother, and I love him, but when I wake up from this surgery, I am never speaking to either of you again," with a steady hand that betrayed the absolute chaos in her soul. She signed her name on the dotted line, sealing her brother's survival and her family's permanent destruction. The surgical transport team arrived mere minutes later, their brisk, efficient movements offering a stark contrast to the profound emotional devastation lingering in the trauma bay. They unlocked the wheels of the gurney, the metallic clatter echoing loudly as they prepared to push Maya toward the sterile, brightly lit operating rooms on the surgical floor. Her parents stood frozen against the far wall, weeping silently, entirely incapable of approaching the daughter who had just saved their son but exiled them forever. The transaction they had orchestrated 16 years ago was finally complete, but the overwhelming cost of their biological engineering was a fractured family that could never be repaired. As they began to roll her out into the main corridor, Maya reached out, her small, cold fingers gripping the sleeve of my wrinkled blue medical coat. I halted the transport team with a swift motion of my hand, leaning down closely to hear whatever final thought she needed to share before the anesthesia took over. "Dr. Harris," she whispered, her exhausted dark eyes staring intensely into mine, possessing a haunting depth that made my own chest ache with profound, unshakable sorrow. "Make sure they know that this marrow belongs to me, and I chose to give it. Make sure they never forget that I was the one who decided. I will make sure it's in the official surgical record. Maya, you saved him entirely on your own terms, I promised, my voice thick with an emotion I rarely show." She offered a microscopic nod, releasing my sleeve, her face peaceful but utterly hollow as she surrendered herself to the clinical machinery of the hospital system. I watched the gurney disappear around the corner, the rhythmic squeak of the wheels fading into the ambient noise of the emergency department, leaving behind an unbearable, suffocating silence. The air in my trauma bay felt heavier than it had all night, thick with the invisible residue of a psychological trauma that no surgical scalpel could ever excise. Richard and Sarah remained in the corner, holding each other in a desperate, trembling embrace, mourning the catastrophic loss of their daughter while simultaneously celebrating the salvation of their son. They had achieved exactly what they set out to do when they walked into that IVF clinic 16 years ago, securing the ultimate biological insurance policy for their family. Yet, as I watched them shuffle out of the emergency room toward the surgical waiting area, they looked like the poorest, most defeated people I had ever seen. They had purchased a miracle, but they had paid for it with the soul of the child they had engineered to be their ultimate savior. I returned to the nurse's station, dropping my heavy frame into the worn leather chair. The glow of the computer monitors casting long, harsh shadows across the cluttered desk. I opened my Onyx electronic chart, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I prepared to document the extraordinary, heartbreaking events that had just unfolded in Bedford in the narrative section. Under the clinical notes regarding her panic attack and subsequent clearance, I typed exactly what I had promised her I would permanently record. Patient provided minor assent with full, independent cognitive capacity. Donation is an autonomous, voluntary act. Independent of parental influence, the printer hummed to life, spitting out the final report. A sterile piece of paper that woefully failed to capture the agonizing human tragedy behind the clinical vocabulary. I signed the bottom with my blue pen, my signature feeling unusually heavy, a small testament to the incredible bravery of a girl born to be a spare part. The emergency doors hissed open again, bringing in the wailing sirens of a fresh trauma, pulling me back into the relentless, unforgiving rhythm of a job that never truly ends. But as I stood up to face the next crisis, Maya's hollow, determined eyes remained burned into my memory. A haunting reminder of the true cost of playing God. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. My shift ended as the pale morning sun began to filter through the frost-covered windows of the hospital cafeteria, casting a cold, indifferent light on the empty tables. I sat with a cup of bitter, burnt coffee, the steam warming my exhausted face as I stared blindly at the rain-slicked pavement of the Boston streets below. The transplant had been a technical success. Leo received the life-saving cells, and Maya was resting in recovery, physically stable but fundamentally changed forever. The medical victory was completely overshadowed by the lingering taste of moral failure. In medicine, we are trained to obsess over the miraculous power of the cure, relentlessly pursuing survival at absolutely any cost, fighting death with every tool we possess. We celebrate the biological triumphs, the flawless genetic matches, and the statistical anomalies, rarely pausing to consider the devastating psychological toll extracted from those forced to bear the burden. Maya was the perfect clinical solution, a masterclass in modern genetic engineering. But inside my trauma bay, she was just a terrified teenager desperate to know she was loved. I have spent 25 years stitching up broken bodies, but I have never felt more profoundly helpless than I did while watching a family's soul tear completely apart. The parents weren't monsters. They were simply terrified humans who allowed their overwhelming fear of grief to completely blind them to the humanity of their own creation. They traded unconditional love for calculated survival, an impossible bargain that ultimately left them stranded in a purgatory of their own making, rich in life, but bankrupt in family. We wear these blue coats and carry these stethoscopes, pretending that we are simply mechanics fixing intricate, beautiful machines. But the truth is far more complicated and messy. Every patient carries a hidden universe of pain, secrets, and fragile loyalties, and sometimes the cure we offer completely destroys the foundation of who they believed they were. Healing the body is a simple matter of biology and mathematics, But healing the profound wounds of betrayal requires an empathy that science simply cannot manufacture. Maya taught me that true autonomy isn't just about giving consent on a medical form. It's about reclaiming your intrinsic worth when the entire world reduces you to your utility. She walked into that operating room not as an engineered donor, but as an incredibly brave young woman who chose to love a brother more than she hated her origin. She proved that even when our existence begins as a cold, clinical calculation, the choices we make define our profound, undeniable humanity. The coffee in my hands had gone completely cold. Much like the sterile environment I have dedicated my entire life to navigating and understanding. I tossed the cup into the trash, adjusted the heavy stethoscope around my neck, and walked slowly toward the exit doors. I was ready to go home, carrying one more invisible scar from the Chronicler of Souls. Forever changed by the girl who was perfectly matched for a terrifying reason.